This video is sponsored by Adobe.
Hi, my name is Chuck Weger, and this is CreativePro Conversations. Today, our guest is Lisa Wellman, one of the powerhouse people in the early industry of what we called desktop publishing back in the day. Welcome, Lisa.
Hi, how are you? It's good to see you again.
It's good to see you. You have been in publishing on and off for since 1776, I think.
It feels that way, doesn't it? Actually, probably in the late mid 80s. Well, actually, from the first Mac, I was involved in looking at both developing a system for the Apple, and we talked. I know at the time I was with AB Dick with my husband Terry Wellman, and we talked to Apple, but they were already working with Brainerd and with PageMaker, and they just weren't particularly interested. So we actually developed for Windows Point 8, a system that was page layout, paint, and draw.
Wow. And Windows Point 8.
Yeah.
So that was fairly early in the day.
Yes.
And so I think your first sort of significant foray into the publishing space that we know about or used to know about was at Letraset. Is that true?
Yeah, really. I think that I had been told by Liz Bond, who was then one of the marketing heads at Adobe. We were moving to the East Coast for a job that Terry had with Verityper, which was a font producer. So that was going nowhere, as you might imagine. And Liz said to me, there's a company I really want you to talk to. Name is Letraset. They're in the graphic arts area. I think that they really could use you. And she set up a meeting with them. I had a meeting with their vice president of sales and marketing. We talked for 3.5 hours, and I finally said, Jim, do I have the job? And he said, well, we've hired from within last week, so we want you. We've got to have you. We'll let go of the PR agency, and we'll hire you to do PR, which I'd never done before. So that was how I got to Letraset and started there. And their first program or the first rollout that I got involved with was they had a package designed by world famous designers, truly, that were templates for pages. So there was some famous designer who did a newsletter or a series of newsletter templates, and some who did a corporate ID templates. And I was supposed to roll these out at Siebold. However, the product wasn't ready for release. And so I had a famous party at Siebold where I introduced the pages on models wearing billboards of pages. It was a disaster. Yeah, so I got written up in the Siebold News the next day as probably the worst launch in the history of launches.
So for our readers who don't know, and that's probably most of them,
Okay.
Siebold was a big graphic arts trade show
Yeah.
back in the day. It fizzled out in the early 2000s, I think.
Well, there's always been some group that understood that the marketplace in general kind of needed, when there were these significant changes taking place, that they needed some guidance in what was happening, how it would affect their business. And we've seen that in so many other cases. But in this particular case, Jonathan Siebold and his organization, I think, were pretty good at focusing the marketplace, the whole publishing, whether it was newspaper, magazine, graphic arts, whatever, on what was happening and how it would impact their business.
Mm-hmm. Getting back to Letraset for a moment,
Yeah.
Letraset it still is, I think, a company.
Yes.
That made dry transfer type, where you took a piece of paper. I used to have some
Rub down, yeah.
Yeah, rub down. You rubbed it down, and it was used a lot by designers
Yes.
in making comps and things, and sometimes in even making the actual product. But they somehow got into electronics because they saw what? Why did they?
Well, they were more, yeah, they handled all the distribution of Pantone. They manufactured and produced Pantone books and pens, pencils, everything that related to Pantone. So they were very much involved with the graphic arts industry. And they had the channel to the graphic artists. They thought that that would be important, and that they thought that that channel would be the place where graphic artists would come to buy software. Didn't work out that way too well, but they got involved with Ready, Set, Go by Manhattan Graphics. They purchased that from them, and that was at the time competing with PageMaker, which was a company here in Seattle, very small company. Paul Brainerd was the head of that, and it was Aldous. And then they also were competing eventually with Quark's publishing
Quark Express.
products. Yeah.
So what year was this when Ready, Set, Go? Because I remember using Ready, Set, Go and being very impressed.
So this would have been in the mid 80s. That
Okay.
they were one of the first out there. And I remember we were still in Chicago when my husband came in, because he was one of those explorers with any kind of technology. And he came in waving this piece of paper and saying to A.B. Dick Company that was doing offset printing, "This is going to change everything." And he had a page that was crude, but it had been produced on some kind of laser write or whatever. And it was from Ready, Set, Go.
Of course, the laser writer, which came out in about 1984, about the same time as the Macintosh, right? Steve Jobs did a deal with Adobe
Yeah.
to get the laser writer. That was a huge change. And eventually we'll get to a conversation about that with someone at Adobe, but
Right.
not today. But so Ready, Set, Go competed with Aldous PageMaker. And the Letraset also had another product called Color Studio or Image Studio.
Image Studio. Image Studio was the first black and white imaging product on the Mac. And it was produced by Fractal Software out of Utah. And the guy who developed it for Fractal, there were two guys at Fractal. His wife was a weaver, I think, and she wanted to be able to look at patterns. And so he developed this piece of software for her. And of course, when you think about it, how significant it was that you could edit images on a desktop computer. And when we look at, well, that's a long story about what has happened to images being used by newspapers, or what has happened to the public use of images, et cetera. What we're now seeing with the ability to, with AR, VR, do all kinds of things to images. So
or AI to create images.
Back in the day, that was the first one. And so, yeah, so Letraset had a suite of tools. It had page layout, it had Image Studio, and eventually Color Studio, which competed with Photoshop for a brief period of time till Photoshop took over the marketplace, and Font Studio, because back in the day, Letraset owned ITC, which is a font manufacturer. And back in the day, fonts used to be, maybe one font would cost a company $500 to be able to use that on their equipment. And now, desktop publishing came along and you could buy 500 fonts for $5. So that
wasn't until a bit later. They
okay.
Still licensed. Now you get 500 fonts by going to freefontsareus.com.
Yes.
And there they all are.
Yeah.
Whether they're ripped off or not, you don't know.
I think that, the thing to me that's so important is that what we were seeing, what we took part in, Chuck, was so much of a change of so many different industries related to what happened, because essentially Apple came along with the Mac, and suddenly you could do things yourself without having to go to a third party or a fourth party or whatever. And we lived through that, constantly trying to solve the problems that came up to enable people to do that. And I live with that every day, and I think it's so interesting.
We'll come back to that. I wanted to somewhere this. We're going to segue to the Mac now.
Okay.
you went to Apple. Um, uh, what time was that?
I went to Apple. They recruited me back in '90, and my first day at Apple was at a Siebel conference in Boston. Before I even went to Cupertino, they had me report to Apple in Boston at a Siebel conference.
And you were at that time you were the vice president of publishing marketing or something. What I don't remember your title.
No, I had moved from being a director of marketing and product marketing at Letraset to being an individual contributor, head of commercial publishing in the U.S.
Okay.
And when I came to Apple and said, okay, what's the plan? What do you want me to do? And they said, we don't know. That's why we hired you. Figure it out.
Okay, so the Mac, obviously everybody knows the story of how the Mac changed publishing and stuff. I just want to, you talked about Image Studio and Color Studio. I want to show you this thing, which is
Oh my goodness.
it's like a $30,000 piece of equipment that we used to use to color in lines, like Mac Paint did with the paint bucket.
Yeah.
This was what they used. Now this was in color, of course, and Mac Paint was black and white initially, but all of a sudden on a $2,000 machine or less, you could do what this giant machine did. And then, of course, Photoshop and Color Studio and things like that came along, and you could do things on the Mac that you could do on a $1 million Cytex machine.
Absolutely. I remember one funny experience where there was a project that I got involved with I think it was the Washington Post and with Izvestia. And the idea was that they were going to publish the same paper. It was a short experiment that they would publish the same thing in Russia, in Russian, and in the United States, obviously in English. And they came to me and they said, well, how big a project is this? Millions of dollars. What we want to do this. And I said, well, you can do it with a few Macs. And they were like, what? How is that possible? I said, yeah, that's really all you'll need. Back in the day, when I was at Letraset, and that was, remember, so early. I think, yes, it was, because I was at the LA Times, and I was horrified, fascinated, but horrified to learn that the backup system for the LA Times was the Mac with PageMaker. The 512K, yes, the 512K Mac with those floppy disks that you had to pull in and out and what constantly change. That was the backup system in case of an earthquake for the LA Times.
Wow.
I know.
Well, must have been pretty confident in it.
It was ridiculous, but I mean, it was interesting that they saw that early, that this could be a device to enable them to still keep communicating.
I think that a lot of publishing people looked at the Mac and said, "This is what we need." I remember I bought a Mac in 2 months after they were announced. I said, "This is the computer I have to have," even though I wasn't in publishing at the time. I was doing spacecraft graphics for NASA, but I said, "This is the way it needs to go."
Yeah.
And of course, most people don't know the story, which is why we're doing these things. So tell us what it was like at Apple. In the early days of the desktop publishing revolution. It was
one of the things that was interesting was that prior to my being at Apple, don't forget, they'd already started the desktop publishing revolution at Apple in the 80s when Steve went to Xerox PARC, saw the star, saw that graphical user interface was the way to go, and came up with a Mac. I think we were seeing that graphical user interface was going to be the future, at least then. And, in early days, Christine Thompson, who's become a good friend of mine, was head of desktop publishing at Apple. And when I came in and took her place back in 90, 91, Apple said, been there, done that, let's move into commercial publishing. And it was like, oh my God, no, this is just the start of what's happening. And the place that Apple really had kind of the edge was in the creative markets. And that was from in the home, people doing the church newsletter, the kind of whatever industry messaging, whatever that they could do themselves, the kinds of things that they can do themselves. In fact, Chuck, in I want to say 87 or 88, we got a Mac 512. My daughter was going off to college. And before she did, she was working for a newspaper. And she went around with her little Mac, kind of that adorable thing, and with some graphics that, and went, she was put in charge of advertising, getting advertising, and she would make up on the fly in their offices. She'd go in, she'd sell them on an ad, and she'd make it up, putting in, kind of graphics and actually fonts. And, you could change a font. Oh my God, it wasn't like a Selectric typewriter where you had to change the whole ball. You could just change, pick a new font. And she earned money for college by doing that on her own. So we were starting to see that happen. And when Apple brought me in, they wanted me to focus on commercial publishing. And we were just starting to get a hefty enough machine that we really could start looking at that market. You were involved in a lot of the testing that was done at the time.
I haven't tracked that. We'll talk about this in a minute.
Okay. Yes. and so I asked, so what do you want me to do? They said, that's why we hired you, go figure it out. And I looked at the market, which they saw as the commercial publishing market. And I saw that there was magazine publishing, newspaper publishing, book publishing, the advertising, all the different segments. And they didn't go to the same shows and they didn't read the same magazines. And I went back and I said, that you want me to have $1 million program, give me something big. And I said, let's start going with $100,000 for each market. And let's look at each market and pick them up individually. And there were many aspects of it. Newspaper publishing was nothing that I had been involved with. And so I went out and got a consultant, said, how do I break into this industry? And one at a time, we picked them off and, started moving Apple into those marketplaces.
Mm-hmm. I worked at one of those places. I worked at a pre-press shop in Washington back in the late 80s and early 90s. And I brought in a Mac to the president of the company, Bruce Cunningham, and I said, look at this. And he said, yeah, I have one of those already. And I said, we need some of these. And he said, yes, I agree. So we bought a bunch of Macs and I started trying to train offset strippers in Quark Express. For those of our readers who don't know, an offset stripper is not that kind of stripper. It's the kind of person who took pieces of film and put them down on a light table and put them together into things like magazine pages and ads and things like that. Anyway, most of the strippers did not want to learn this stuff at all. They wanted to keep doing film. They knew how to do film. They knew how to do photography. They didn't want to learn the Mac. So we brought in younger people who could do that stuff. And that in some way led to this project that I think, was it you who funded it or with Mills Davis? How did that come about? Okay.
Oh, is this testing the speeds?
Yeah, this is the Macintosh versus the Cytex study.
Absolutely, because you really have to show an industry that such and such is possible with real data. What a
concept. We don't deal with that anymore.
No, I know. But it was really important to get the naysayers to see what could be done. And so we decided that there were certain things that we could show and test. How long did it take to do it on a $1 million machine, a proprietary machine that was produced that way, or on a Mac with some software, and tested, one against the other, and showed how the Mac was very, very capable of doing what needed to be done at a price point that changed everything. It wasn't only that they could do it. You can always find another piece that does it, but this was, I don't know how to express it, magnitudes of cost less than what the high-priced machines cost.
Right. I think we probably spent $20,000 on the setup that we did. We had a Quadra, which we have a I think we had a Quadra, or maybe a Macintosh 2FX, which was the wicked fast machine, they called it back then.
Right.
And we had this study was something that eventually, with the initial data was funded by Apple, and I think Mills Davis, who was managing part of the study, put out this brochure.
Right.
We did. We had 128 megabytes of memory in that machine, which was huge for the time, right? The Mac shipped with 8 megabytes of memory.
Right, right. But we know we beefed it. You
Yeah, we
needed
beefed
to
it up
have
a
that.
lot. We beefed it up a
Yeah.
lot, and in comparison, and we did all of these sort of tests, you know, of basically Photoshop. It was Photoshop 2.0.1 versus a Cytex system, which cost, you know, on the order of $1 million. And we did a lot of different images that people would use. We tried to pick realistic images that were used in catalogs and magazines. And the Mac beat the Cytex at image editing tasks 70% of the time.
Yeah.
I mean, there were a lot of things that the Cytex could do better, like individual color corrections of certain areas. We can, of course, do now in Photoshop just by blinking our eyes.
Yeah.
But it was a big deal. And I remember that sparked a cross-country tour, as I recall. Where
I remember that well, really, because I think that, well, my husband was involved, my daughter was involved in putting together all these machines, because we had a lot of different aspects. So we had page layout, we had image layout, we had image correction, all kinds of things that we wanted to demonstrate to these audiences. I think there were 15 or 17 cities involved. And I know that Samantha, my daughter, had to pack up and have all
I remember that.
And you helped. Thank you very much. You helped her get this stuff from city to city to city, but it was quite a complex organization to get the show set up in each of these cities. But I think it was very meaningful for the marketplace to really get the opportunity to talk to you and others right there, see the machines, see what was happening. You know, a lot of early days of computers, they would demonstrate by taking, kind of, look, I'm going to put this in and press this button. And of course, it was all rigged, so it would come out the other side very fast.
Right.
Yeah, but this was real. This was showing, the work in progress. And there was a lot of that in the early years. I mean, I think that there were 10 years easily that we spent from my time with Letraset into my time with Apple, just spent in industry shows demonstrating the capabilities and the impact, so that people, really could start to think about that. And it was terrifying. I mean, one of the things I talk about today, as we look at technology changing things, in 2 years, Chuck, if you remember, 1,500 typesetters, businesses that existed, were out of business.
Mm-hmm.
It was 2 years before they just weren't going to go there for all the needs of typesetting, when you could do it on a Mac for a fraction of the cost.
Well, and the same thing, of course, happened in the internet era, which we're not talking about in this video.
Not yet, yeah.
But that put everybody out of business too.
Yeah, changed things a lot.
Technology does that. Motor cars put buggy whip manufacturers out of business.
And I think the thing that we're seeing today is faster and faster, so that we're on this trajectory that I think it's so important to really be aware of. And I think for those of us who are considered, it's so funny when in my world today, people say, oh, you were a pioneer of computing. And it was like, yeah, no, I was there. I helped out where I could. I was part of that transformation, but yeah, not a pioneer. I just was there in earlier days.
Technology is moving faster and faster. I mean, this Mac that I'm using right now is powered entirely by Bitcoin. So, and I'm looking at you through VR goggles, which are actually just my glasses. So that's
excellent. Right. Yeah.
So getting back to whatever it is we were talking about, Apple was super focused on publishing. That was one of their big markets, right? Because designers could use the capabilities of the Mac. Most businesses who were doing spreadsheets and maybe Microsoft Word documents, they didn't care about fine graphics, right?
Well, you know what? It's always been interesting to me from the very beginning. One of my biggest customers was Microsoft, because Microsoft Marketing was a Mac shop.
Really?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Most marketing facilities in whatever company, there were two separate sides of the house. There's the accounting business side of the house, and that's the spreadsheets and what have you. But if you were going to the marketing portion, you'd use a Mac. Don't forget, not only was the layout so much easier and the focus of Apple, our focus was on that marketplace, but also as we got into color, we really were leaders in color management. And for a long time, that was a differentiator. That was one of our secret sauces with Apple, was that we focused on color and color management on the desktop.
Yeah, tell me about color management. I'm sure a lot of users don't even know what that means. A lot of our viewers, certainly a lot of users don't know what it means. And it was for some number of years a huge topic in
And it
public.
was it was a huge topic because we had to do on this what might have been a $20,000 machine back in those days, which was all ramped up and everything with, additional RAM and ROM and whatever, so that it could handle these files of images, large images. But we also had to look at the management of color. So what I saw on the screen, first of all, did you calibrate from one screen to another screen? So I could see this color if I looked at this Mac, but then I could go over here and the color was different on that Mac. So how do you make sure that the screens are what you're seeing from screen to screen? And then what kind of information are you sending so that the color, when it needs to get to the press, is the same color that you intend? And all of that was being revolutionized. I remember, do you remember being in Boston for that, looking at what is a proof? What do you need to say? Do you need to produce something and say, I want you to match this color here? Or is it, if I can see it there and then it comes out the same color on the press, is my screen the proof? Or we had a whole discussion on that. I remember at one specific trade show. In any event, we decided that we needed to utilize and promote Apple's capability in color management. And so we created the Apple Color Management Association. And then I started hearing from Kodak, who had done a lot of work with color and had a lot of people who were very familiar with color. And they said, wait a second, we've got a lot of color information here, and Linotype and other companies that were involved in Gray Tag. I mean, I think of the names. I haven't spoken those words in a long, long time, but we talked about that. And I realized that there were many players in the world. They each had something to say. And so we backed off. I remember that this whole discussions that we were having, we backed off and we created the International Color Consortium because we realized that everybody had to be at the table in order to make it work for everybody. So yeah, that was an interesting time.
And what did
Gary Starkweather, you may remember, who was the inventor of the laser writer when he was at Xerox PARC.
They didn't call it the laser writer back then.
I don't know what they called it.
Yeah, anyway, yes.
Yeah, but he was just one of the greatest guys that I'd ever worked with. And he was at Apple before he went as a Microsoft fellow came up to Seattle to work with Microsoft. But he was very much involved with the International Color Consortium and the development of that and getting that going as well, I think.
And so for the first time ever, basically, the ICC and all the affiliated organizations and software developers made it possible for us to see on the screen what we would actually see that came from a printing press.
Yeah. And it wasn't, this is not like, let's have a meeting and decide. And, I mean, this was years that we were involved in all of this. And the machine had to change. People had to change the way that they did things so that, kind of it worked. There were a lot of changes in the marketing industry and publishing in general, magazine publishing, book publishing, anything that used publishing. And then if you recall, we got to a point where people said, well, do I need to spend the money to go to 4-color, 5-color output? Why don't I send a PDF file? And that was another change, that took place, kind of started to take place as we got with the internet came along, but that's further along, perhaps.
Yes, yes. We'll get to the internet in one conversation, hopefully before the internet dies off and is replaced by direct brain
I saw somebody who had a chip in their hand. That
really?
was, yes. Forget that, but
This is scary to me already.
Yes.
Of course, well, I mean, talking about PDFs, we're going to have a session about PDFs as well, because PDFs also radically changed the world.
Yes.
I mean, Apple changed the world. Adobe with Photoshop and Acrobat radically changed the world. I'm not sure how much Illustrator changed the world, but it was important. I know there are a lot of Illustrator users who watch CreativePro videos, so we'll say, yes, Illustrator changed the world. And page layout changed the world.
Yeah.
First things like Ready, Set, Go and PageMaker, and then Quark Express and Adobe InDesign. So tell me, what were some of the hardest things that you had to do to convince people while you're at Apple, to convince people that the Mac was viable for publishing and they didn't have to use super expensive systems?
Well, part of the thing that we were doing, as you may recall, was we were constantly making adjustments and figuring out what was needed and what were the problems that would come up. And a lot of things, I think, were trial by error. I told you about my first day at Apple being at a CBOL conference, and Apple was having trouble with the print drivers, just the regular print drivers in those days. And I thought it was interesting. I went down to the opening. My first day at Apple. I knew nobody at Apple really, other than the people who had interviewed me. But I was reporting to the Boston CBOL conference, and I went down to the opening, which was a panel of people from different companies. And they were, Apple specifically, the representative was asked about print drivers. And what he said was, we're working on that. But of course, it only really impacts 10% of the market. And so, it'll be a while. And I went back upstairs to the PR suite that had been set up for Apple, and I came in and saying, oh my God, you have to do something. You have to do a press release or something. They said, why? And I said, I told them what this gentleman had said. And they said, so I said, that 10% is the audience that we're talking to. You have to do something. And they said, don't be ridiculous. Nothing's going to happen. Well, the T-shirt came out the next day. I don't know if you remember, but, and I can't remember the guy who did it, but everybody was wearing these, I'm a member of the 10%, T-shirts. And yeah, so it really was an inside and an outside job. So inside, it was really saying to people, hey, people, you have, actually, at that point, Apple was ready to turn its back on desktop publishing because been there, done that. We made some money. It's in the bag, and it's like, no, we have to own the creative space, and that is many different markets. But it's a huge, and it's the place where we have the DSUV, our distinctly superior user value. What can we do better than anything else that's out there? And it was to serve the creative market. And so, that was my focus. And it was an inside job talking about the specific things that had to happen to the Mac. One of the things, if you remember back in the day, people would switch out their memory so that they would load up machines because they needed it for the job and then give it to somebody else on their machine because they needed that.
Because memory was very expensive.
It was very expensive. And consequently, when Apple showed me one of the designs that they were doing, and I said, it was always, can you get there before the engineers build it? Can you get there and talk about what does the customer need before the engineers build it? And they showed me, I said, well, how are you going to change out the memory? And they show, here, it's easy. You take this and you open this and you take this out, and you move that out, and then you have to do this, and then you can put it in here. And I said, no. Well, that's not what we do in the market that I'm representing. We need to be able to go open, change out, shut, and get on with the work. And so it was that kind of thing inside. And then outside, it was going market by market, having their own trade shows, having their own demonstrations of producing. And we were able to do it with more and more with Quark, especially, would create these additional pieces of software so that you could create a catalog, that you could create a newspaper, because some of the things needed to be different.
Sure.
And yeah, and I know you got very involved in writing scripts that enabled things to work better. And so that had to be developed, and then work with the industry, with people like yourself, who played a key role in I got oiling the skids, or whatever the expression is, but kind of creating those little pieces. And one of the things that was really exciting for me was being able to go somewhere in the world. And this was a great lesson, going somewhere in the world and finding a company, small company. They didn't have the means to get out in the big marketplace, but they had this piece of something that, when slotted in between this big thing and this big thing, made something work. And finding that company, bringing them into one of the trade shows so that the marketplace could see them, helping them. That was an exciting thing to be part of.
Building solutions.
Building solutions. Yeah.
Yeah, because here's a product, but it doesn't do what I want. But over there is this guy who makes this thing. And now if we put them together, it does that.
Yeah. And that's a lot of the work we both did. I know you did, coming with the work that you did in the industry. And then, being in charge of the Apple booth at these trade shows, internationally, nationally, bringing them into the booth, bringing them to some of the demonstrations that we did at corporate. Bringing in some of the big hitters to show them what you actually could do. It was a time and people had to, that was going on, and companies had to say, yes, we're going to invest in a new way of doing things. And then some companies, if you remember, I remember talking to a company whose name I will not mention because I think it's kind of embarrassing. And I said to them, you need to know what's happening. I think you need to know what's happening, because the changes are going to impact the marketplace so significantly. And everything can't be done at that high end. Right now we're seeing small shops open up that can do pre-press work that could be done before, because they weren't willing to make the multi-million-dollar investment. And now you could open a shop and do the same work on a beefed up Mac. And when I went to this big company, they said, we have enough customers. We don't need to do that.
Yes.
They're not in business anymore, so I don't know that anybody would remember their name.
Well, I mean, and then of course, 10 or 15 years later, prepress went away as the internet came around, and designers could do their own, and they didn't need any of that. I mean, a lot of the people, I would say almost all of the people at CreativePro conferences come from a background where they're just used to designing their own stuff. And here it is, it outputs on my local inkjet or whatever, or I send it to a place down the street and they output it for me. And that was inconceivable.
It also changed, where things happen. I remember one of the discussions that all of a sudden you could do things with color. The designers could do things with color that they previously sent to pre-press shops. But then there was a while where you said, yeah, but would you be responsible for the color? Because the pre-press shop had to be responsible for what came out of the press. Suddenly designers could make color decisions and whatever, but they didn't want to be responsible for the final product. And it was a market in flux. And we see that, I think, all over as various things changed. I'm more involved in, we won't go there completely, but I'm more involved with the creation, the changes that took place in the film industry because of the work that we were doing. And I remember I was just talking to somebody about the first Digital World show that took place in LA that Jonathan Siebold also was involved with. He saw things were changing in press and in, paper printing kind of area. And then he also saw that the Mac was significantly impacting what was happening in film.
Yeah, and one of our conversations is going to be about digital photography and how that came to be.
Well, I'm also talking about the movie industry.
Well, the movie industry, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think Pixar owns that now, right? And ILM.
They're a big player. They're a big player. But, it used to be that, and I think that this is what we're seeing is why digital is so important, why computers available to us. When I look at this little thing that I hold in my hand, and I think that I have more power here than I had when I was programming mainframes. I can, really access things so easily. There's been that continuous change. And I think to the marketplace in general, and you're talking to creative pros worldwide. The idea is you have to be really aware of what's happening, where it's happening, and the changes that are taking place and the opportunities therefore. And that's another thing. It's not just the change, and sometimes it's tough, but there are new opportunities opening constantly, and it's scary, but it's exciting.
Right. I'm too old to be scared, but well, let's shift gears a little bit and explain how you did the transition. You are now a state senator in the state of Washington.
Yes.
And coming from a publishing background, a marketing publishing, what on earth prompted you to want to do that?
Well, I've always been involved in, kind of in terms of my life, it's always family and nonprofit, my job, and also politics.
Like Apple?
I've always been.
The
What?
nonprofit formerly called Apple?
When I was there, yes.
Yeah, okay.
We were underwater the entire time. When I tell people my stock options were at $13.
Yeah.
Yeah, we won't discuss that any further.
Okay.
It's not a good story. But as far as politics were concerned, I had been involved when I came to the state of Washington. We moved up here. Hewlett Packard had brought me into a .com to head up a .com. It was in the craze in the late 90s, early 2000s, and everybody wanted to work at a .com. It was where things were happening. And so we came up here with a commitment to go, just for 4 years. And then the market went to hell in a handbasket. And so, but I got very involved with the new governor with the campaign, her campaign. It was a woman. I don't think that I had been involved in a state with a woman governor before. Anyhow, I was very excited with her.
It was
background.
illegal. It's going to be illegal again soon. Sorry, we won't go there.
Please. Anyway, a long story short, she invited me after she won to participate in a state board, and I got involved in doing economic development, which was interesting to me around the state of Washington. And I was known around rural communities, but not so much where I was. But in any event, I had worked with my local representative. They needed somebody to run. That's one of the things that you learn, that you don't want somebody to not have to spend money to get their seat. And so there was, the Republican had no competition, and they needed him to have competition. And so they came to me and they said, would you run for the Senate? And I had not thought of doing it, but remember at Apple, I felt like I had this platform to change people's lives. I could change markets. I could take a company, as I said, a small company that had no access to the market, and bring them into the booth, show them off to people, change their lives, change what people could do because of that little piece of software. It was heady stuff. And I thought, I'm getting older. This is a platform where I still can make a difference, perhaps. And so that was very intriguing to me. And I ran. And, one of the things I think is really important is this was a game that I didn't know. So I got a campaign manager, just the same way when I came to Apple and I didn't know newspaper publishing. I got somebody who knew newspaper publishing to guide me. And so I had a campaign manager and did what she said. She was young enough to be maybe my granddaughter, but I listened to her and won the election. And so right now I chair education for the state of Washington in the Senate. And it is an opportunity to use all the lessons that we were talking about, Chuck, and about how technology is changing the world. And how do I make sure, people say, what district are you in? I said, well, I have 1.5 million constituents. They're the school children in the state of Washington, and they're all my constituents. It's my job, I think, to make sure that they have what they need to leave our education system equipped to handle the 21st century digital economy. And so we're doing a lot of the things that I hope will make a difference in their lives and enable them to thrive.
So how do you use your Apple experience in politics in doing this? I mean, you say that we want our children to learn the 21st century economy. I don't think there's anybody in the state of Washington who would disagree with that, and possibly not in the US.
Oh, you would be so wrong.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, everybody knows more about, not everybody. There are many people who feel that they know more about education than the educators. There is definitely a war on education going on today. And so I think that, it's very important for me to talk about, I think, taking all those experiences of how we saw businesses disappear, of how, we've talked for a long, long time about, lifelong learning. What ridiculousness is that? But right now, as you look at the future, no matter what you're doing, you're going to have to recertify. The equipment is going to change. How things are done is going to change faster. And so you really are going to have to be learning and relearning and changing along with the tools that are used to do the job. When I came here, I could go into Eastern Washington and literally see 100 people in a field picking a crop. And now I can tell you, not everywhere, but in some cases, if I go out to Eastern Washington, I'll see an autonomous vehicle doing the same thing that those 100 people did. And there's nobody in the field. It's an autonomous vehicle, GPS, the whole thing. And so we're seeing those changes in every aspect of life, I think, and seeing taking part in a revolution of technology, as we did in Apple and in various fields. I think that was a lesson that has been really profound in terms of trying to see what needs to happen, what children need, what teachers need now to learn that's different than what they had to do before. Right now, we're talking about synchronous and asynchronous learning. So it's not just in a room with a teacher at the front of the room where we all sit with our books. Now, in the state of Washington, we're making sure that every child has a device and then has access to internet. That's broadband is another thing that that I focus on as one of the aspects of things that are changing. And I think I very much try to share my own experience in the evolution of industries and how they've changed in just my lifetime, and why we need to be aware of that and help our kids get what they need.
Well, that's great. And I think that is a really nice thing to end on. Thank you very much, State Senator Lisa Wellman, for talking to us today at CreativePro Conversations. And we look forward to seeing your name on the presidential ballot.
No, that's not going to happen. I'm very happy working in the state of Washington. We're a trifecta state. We have, as Democrats, we have all three, the House, the Senate, and the governorship. And we get things done.
Okay.
Very satisfactory.
We do that at CreativePro as well, getting things done.
Good.
All right.
Good to hear.
Thanks for watching, everybody.